Revelation, taking Revelation at face value is really tricky because it is heavily loaded with symbolism, and also references to things that like we are 2,000 years removed from the context too. So there are not only there's not only imagery but also references within it that are very hard for a modern reader to immediately guess. And even people who specialize in Revelation as a text, specialize in antiquities, specialize in, in the Greek of the New Testament. And in fact, also one thing worth mentioning is also that whoever wrote Revelation, presumably one of the people named John, whether it's John son of Zebedee, John the Elder, whoever that is, or John of Patmos, whoever that is, whoever wrote John, Greek is not his first language, and his Greek is, by most scholars' assessments, like really terrible Greek. So it's a person who's it's not their first language, trying to write. It's like, if I tried to write some really involved thing in French, which I can kind of get around with a little bit of French. If I was dropped in France, I'd probably be all right, but I'm not going to be particularly great at communicating whatever it is, especially if it's a really highly symbolic, highly contextualized idea. Somebody said that I've heard people say that the Greek of Revelation is like a child's.
Yeah, I think
so.
And you have to realize that, well, we'll get into this later on in the lessons, but Revelation is not a predictive book.
It's like, it's hard. It's hard to say because some of it reads like that, but on the other hand, it's worth noting.
It's kind of like Lord of the Rings, all the creatures.
Well, I have to say this. I was thinking about this recently because a lot of people put a lot of stock in the predictions of found in the Bible, but
so did the writers of the New Testament.
We're right, exactly.
They revised the Old Testament.
Right. But it's worth noting that most of the predictions in the Bible don't come true.
Yeah.
Because the fundamental aspect of prophecy in the entire Bible, but especially of the Hebrew prophets, but also even of the New Testament, the fundamental aspect of prophecy is not telling the future, is not prediction, but is being desperately caught up in the concerns of God. So the concerns of unrighteousness, lack of justice, lack of love, all of these things, being concerned with God's concerns rather than the concerns of man is the fundamental attribute of prophecy in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And anything that they say about the future, any predictive things about the future are just as likely to be wrong. Because, for example, what if you say, well, if this doesn't happen, then, if A, B, or C doesn't happen, then this will take place. But then if A, B, and C do happen and it doesn't happen, you go, see, you were wrong. You're like, well, I wasn't wrong. A, B, and C happened.
Yeah.
You need to go out. You're making noise.
And,
and so it may or may not happen depending on what happened, or it partially happens, so something different, A and B happen, but not C, so it's predictive stuff, even in the Bible, by the Bible's own standards, is pretty sketchy.
Yeah. And when we think prophet, you think about King, Martin Luther King Jr., he was a prophet, and he, in that last conclusion, he said, I'm about to do I'm supposed to be focused on God's work. That's what.
Let's take a look at this one right here is the thing that was on the board last week or last time. So you guys have those questions. Mm-hmm. These are questions that in some form or another have been asked since the very beginning, and that various groups have had various answers to. Now there is a line that we will come to know as orthodoxy that does generally speaking go all the way back, but like we said a couple weeks ago, it goes back to is a belief that, a handful of beliefs that were believed at the time and ultimately won out. Like, they were not the only things that people believed, the only answers to these questions. And even today, many of these questions are still asked. So this is an ongoing dialogue within the church.
I'm sorry.
What's that?
What is Ashkelon?
Eschaton.
Eschaton.
Yeah, the eschaton is the end times. Is the
end
fruition,
times?
the end times. Yeah, the eschaton is the fruition of God's plan, whatever that looks like. Excuse me. That's what I was going to say because of the reading today. Speaking of 6 days, it's also worth noting that, and this is sort of my own thing. I think maybe I've heard one other person comment on it, but there's a moment people often read. Speaking of predictive things, people often read certain moments of the New Testament as predicting the eschaton like pretty soon, and for sure you can read things that way. But at least one of those moments when Jesus tells the disciples, there are some of you alive today who will have a glimpse of the kingdom before you taste death. A lot of people have read that to be like, well, that was a prediction that the eschaton was coming within their lifetimes, and then of course it didn't happen. However, it's worth observing that episode where he says, there's some of you present, there are some of you here today who will glimpse the kingdom before you taste death. And the next thing that happens is 3 of them are with him at the transfiguration. He takes them up to the mountain and they see him in a preview of a glorified form alongside 2 people who are dead, right?
Would they be people that you know, or would they be people like Elijah, etc.?
Well, sorry, how do you mean? Would who be?
Because there's that book of the 5 people that you see.
Oh no, it's named. It's
or
named.
Is it going to be like, Elijah and
Well, I don't know about the ultimate,
Or you
like at the end, but at the transfiguration, it's Moses and Elijah speaking to.
I kind of thought
Yeah,
so.
and then it's and then Peter, James, and John are with him, and so those 3 get a glimpse of the kingdom before, like, during their lifetime. So I can't, I'm just reading that and going, that seems to make some sense. There's no guarantee. I don't know. Some people may say, well, he's probably really talking about the eschaton. But I think it's the way that it's situated. People don't always catch that it could easily be referring to that. And it would make sense, I think. But so anyway, so today we're going to talk a little bit about text, and we're going to talk a little bit about people. The period after the apostles, the group of people after the apostles, especially those people who were writing things, is called they're referred to as the early church fathers. And the study of the early church fathers and their writings is called patristics. It's something I would love to spend more time on, and I have not had much of a chance to sit down and read through them. But maybe when the kids are grown.
I'm telling you to get in touch with my ex-husband.
I really just have to wait for the kids to be grown. But it's a very interesting time because it's a time where even though their writings, the patristics are generally considered to be legitimate. They're considered by almost all churches that I can think of to be, these are legitimate church writings, but they are not considered canon. They are not considered for inclusion in the Bible. And as a result, particularly in the wake of the Reformation, where getting strict about what belongs in the Bible for Protestants, even to the exclusion of the Apocrypha, which are still in Catholic Bibles, and some things.
And in this one?
And in that. And
What is it?
Mark, sorry, what?
What is the Apocrypha?
The Apocrypha are a handful of Second Temple Jewish texts that are not in the Hebrew Bible, and they're not part of the New Testament, but they were part of that era where Jesus lived, during which Jesus lived and arose, and there were some texts that were commonly read. They also were included largely because they were most of what we had. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 40s, there was an explosion of Second Temple literature all of a sudden. Like we were like, oh my gosh, we didn't think any of this, so
The study of language.
Is that what's called the Gnostic Bible, the Gnostic?
not quite, but I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Yes, yeah.
The Gnostic.
But they're similar. They're related and they're similar. It's also part of a discovered cache of texts. Yeah, and I actually have them with me. So anyway, those were some Second Temple Jewish texts that were considered relevant for study, but not part of the canon, not part of the Bible per se. Yeah.
So somewhere those little
Apocryphal.
Here's the word.
Yeah.
is
Yeah, they're tucked in right between the Old Testament and the New Testament in Catholic Bibles. They're actually called intertestamental literature.
wow.
The intertestamental period.
I've never heard that before.
So these
Yeah.
actual things are
What do they
somewhere,
say?
the apocryphals.
What
Right,
the
do
writings
they
are
speak on?
somewhere.
Well,
Okay.
they taught a few
And
things.
I encourage you guys, check out this
Yeah.
one of these Bibles.
Or is it this one?
Yeah,
This
It's that
one?
one, yeah. They're
Yeah.
all the big Oxford.
they talk about a few things. One is kind of a continuation of the book of Ezra.
It's
Okay.
the
At least one is a prayer. I'm trying to think just off the top of my head what's in there, but they're just Elijah, did Elora just run outside? Go
It's
check.
more like Psalms.
So these are
In the
written
second?
and they're.
Yeah. So here,
Elora,
Where
go.
are the originals?
oh, we don't know where the originals are.
No, you have to
Might
talk
be
to
in
mom, not me.
Alexandria.
Yeah.
And so if you go towards the middle, go to
Mom,
like,
not me.
let's see.
Find her.
Um,
There you go.
oh, you can too.
Yes, you can.
She's making a
Oh, so
recording.
Sirach, Baruch,
Page.
Wisdom.
But it only
Oh,
has
Wisdom of Solomon is.
Triple
She's
three.
making a
It's triple
recording.
three.
Okay, well, leave her
You'll
be.
find it.
So
It's
here
at
you
the
go.
end of the.
Like Wisdom of Solomon. Is it
Oh,
after
making
Esther?
a recording?
That was
Wisdom
one
of
the
Solomon, I
things
think,
you
is-
can
Sit
like
with
that.
us.
Can
Yeah,
I-
sit
is
in
it
here with
okay
us.
if I do this? Because
Sirach,
I-
Baruch,
And what,
We're going
let's
outside.
see.
and what I would
It's
say.
nice
Letter of
outside.
Jeremiah, Prayer of
Is it
Azariah,
door unlocked?
Susanna,
Yeah.
Go
It really
outside.
and the
Right.
and the
Is it
Maccabees, which is
unlocked?
where we get the
Yeah.
Hanukkah story.
It's
The Maccabees are in there.
And I thought,
Yeah,
I'm trying to think,
the Maccabees.
Brad's gonna be a
Oh,
hard
sorry.
act to follow, but I was wondering, what are we gonna do this fall? And because we've talked about these books, I might have to do some studying over the summer. Maybe we'll, if people want to, we can study these books.
Yeah,
Next fall. It's kind of interesting, because there's some, we've kind of touched on them a little bit
Uh-huh.
in the lessons, but some of them are really great. They're beautiful, and some of them are kind of silly.
yeah. I was thinking that it might be interesting to do a period of Bible study just on words,
Oh,
on vocab. That would be
okay.
interesting.
You know I love
But-
Oh, yeah,
vocabulary.
because you use vocab.
Oh, I love
That is
vocabulary.
like, huh?
Oh, is this one mine?
So here we
Yes.
are.
Yeah.
So please, like, if you go out and borrow these books, you know, these are, and you'll find on the bottom they have
I
all
let 'em
kinds
go
of
outside to
notes
play.
and cross references.
I like that.
And at
Okay.
the
They
beginning
can
of
only
each
go
book,
to the
like,
fence.
To the fence.
there's like
Right,
a whole lot
okay.
of
I said, here's
information.
wolves.
It's just, you might already know it, but it's just interesting
Yeah.
to read the background.
Yeah, some of the stories we hear about and we don't realize they're not actually in the Bible, you know, and so, like the story of Susanna and the elders, that a lot of people know, but they don't realize it's not in Protestant Bibles. But anyway, so,
Bell and the Dragon.
but so anyway, there are texts, I mean, even, I think we were saying that one of the letters, during the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther didn't even want to include the letter of James or Revelation in the Bible.
Yeah.
So Revelation, you know, if he'd had his way, Protestant Bibles wouldn't even have two of the New
Yeah.
Testament books they do.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
but the study of the patristics, it's the study of the early communications, particularly at the outset, the early communications between some of the bishops of the overseers of the church. So like Polycarp, just any of the extant writings, any of the writings that were there, is really is very interesting for watching the development of the early church and the development of the thinking in the early church. And so anyway, the early church fathers don't just give us a development of the doctrine and religion, they give us a glimpse of the earliest traditions and even hint at some things that have since been lost to history, like other writings that we no longer have. Or writings, so for example, a guy who I've admitted to having, like nerdy, I'm just obsessed by, is a church father named Papias. And Papias, according to tradition, collected, and it's fairly stable tradition because many people refer to it, he collected 5 books of stories, quotations, and everything else that he could from as many people who knew Jesus, knew the disciples, studied under them, blah, blah, blah. Collected 5 books worth of material, and they're all lost.
And they're all what?
Yeah.
Lost.
I was kind of wondering, is there anything written about Jesus during the time, when, I guess, the Bible refers to him, I guess, from birth to about young teenager.
Yeah.
And then they don't come back
Right.
and speak of anything in him until towards the end. But
Yes.
all that time, is it anything written about where he was or
There,
what he
yes,
was doing?
there are, but there's not a lot that's reliable. There are what are called infancy gospels among some of the rejected literature, and it's written later, has no apparent basis in fact. There are stories of him making clay birds out of dirt, and his father comes and reprimands him for doing that on the Sabbath, and he just claps, does whatever, and they come to life. Another of him getting angry at a kid who does something to him, and so he just curses him. The kid falls down dead. Another one, does he fall off a roof or something, and he brings him back to life.
The bird and the falling off the roof.
Or something like that,
Something
yeah.
like that, yeah.
I feel like maybe I'm confusing the one where the person fell out the window while Paul was preaching and died,
Well,
and he brought him back. That's in
in the book of
Acts.
Yeah.
But did the kid fall off a roof in the other one? Either way,
I
there's
read
some.
something like that. Yeah,
I can look it up.
Yeah, there are some, but it's just they're not usually very reliable because they tend to be older texts that are just kind of filling out with legend. Yeah.
And
I know I heard somewhere in life that that during that time that he was studying in the I guess the Middle
Like
East
India?
with the mystics of
Yeah,
the,
there's
Middle East
that.
and-
There are also stories of him that maybe Joseph of Arimathea was like an uncle or a relation, and that he went and studied under the Druids in England.
Mhm.
There's all there are lots of stories like
and
that.
how, in the journey of how the gospel really did make it into East Asia, what would be India?
India would be
Asia?
South
So
Asia.
how the gospel made it there, and that's when you talk about Gnostic.
That'd be Thomas. That's
Yeah.
what Thomas. Yeah.
When you talk about the Gnostic Gospels, a lot of the feminist theologians have taken a hold of the Gnostic Gospels because they're more spiritual versus physical in terms of their affirmations, and that there's the stories of how Thomas, journeyed to spread the gospel in India, and those are, like Brad is saying, they're we just don't know, and we can settle with the mystery that it got there.
Yeah. It's actually I'll go ahead and I'll just show you this now because we're talking about it. These are 3 books. This is not total because this doesn't include all the Dead Sea Scrolls. But what you're referring to is the Nag Hammadi Library. In Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in 1940, late 40s or something? I can't remember.
We were just beginning to learn
Oh,
about
that's
them
my favorite book.
in the 80s.
Oh, I thought it was Othello.
Oh, no. But
Like in the 80s when I was in seminary, the Nag Hammadi texts had been discovered, and it was 40 years prior to that, so we learned about them.
Yeah, I remember my dad saying that he said he said one time, because there was a movie that came out and they were talking about how in the Nag Hammadi text they found the Gospel of Thomas, and they were like, and the church has kept this quiet for whatever. And my dad's like, you can get it at the library. It's not some vast conspiracy. It's not true.
Nobody's saying you can't read it.
Yeah, but so these things do take their time to go through scholars to assess the historicity of the dating and things like that, and then eventually they become public once the original documents have been, copied, taken care of in terms of preservation, translated, whatever. It takes some time for sufficient number of experts to preserve them and make copies and make sure that they're in good condition and or as good a condition as they can be, and do the reading and the translating and assessment of dating it and blah 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 before they then make it into like a paper copy that the public can read. But
And
they
it's
ultimately
the
do.
thesaurus, like they have to have all these scholars to say, well, what does this phrase mean?
Right, and then somebody else goes,
That
well,
phrase means-
kinda.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so this was I can never remember which, but the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and the Nag Hammadi Library were found relatively close to each other in time. They were both sort of early mid 20th century finds, and this one was in Egypt. The Dead Sea Scrolls was along the Dead Sea. This literature, though, the Dead Sea Scrolls was hugely comprised of Second Temple Jewish literature. The Nag Hammadi Library was primarily Gnostic Christian literature. So from the early church, but again, not that early, most of it. A lot of it. The Gospel of Thomas is a little bit iffy. That depending on, it's hard to date that one. But by the time that you get to this, it's highly mystic, highly esoteric, and it's very. And so I'm gonna read you something, which is one of the best summaries.
I have to go out and cough. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Dry throat.
This is one of the best summaries that I've heard of how these texts are just how you find these texts. So it says this journalist who was traveling around and looking at these things, and he was reading through the Gospels, but he was also reading some of the things, the apocryphal stuff that is relevant to the apostles that he was trying to track down their final resting places. Yeah, good luck. It's hard, but so he says, so there's an Acts of John. Some of the most popular legends concerning John can be found within the Acts of John, from the unique Christian traditions in Alexandria in Egypt. So anyway, it was apocryphal. It was not part of the New Testament, and it was basically condemned as like, that's not a real text. But so he says this. I loved this. He says, to read any apocryphal work is to vacate a series of expectations. The first vacation is spiritual. However edifying these works purport or attempt to be, their non-canonical standing renders their message curiously distant from the expediences of faith. For the non-religious reader, the distance is similar to that which one feels in the presence of any religious work, but with the added yardage of knowing that an apocryphal work is, in some faint but definite sense, a failed work. It just was not accepted overall, finally. The second vacation is formal. The Gospels, despite some considerable literary inadequacies, from a modern reader's viewpoint at least, are commendable in many ways. They have structure, contrapuntal detail, rhythm, and style. This helps them remain grippingly relevant to millions of people, most of whom know nothing about life in first century Palestine or the complicated manner in which Jewish and Greek thought enriched each other in the Roman world. Jesus' confrontation with Pilate, his frustration with his disciples, the agony of Judas, the miracles, all stand out, even for readers of no particular faith, as powerful stories about courage, fear, failure, love, and death. The apocryphal works are not like this. They are sloppy, repetitive, frequently boring, often obscure, usually ugly, bizarrely circuitous, and typically build to moments of dramatic import, baffling to all but the most cross-eyed sectarian. The apostolic heroes of the Apocrypha have precious few modes. They are stentorian moral teachers, wondrous miracle workers, tender-footed wanderers, and world champion denunciators of Jews, pagan gods, marriage, sexuality, and most other forms of human pleasure. One can certainly become sick of reading the Gospels, but one never really tires of them. The optimal reading of an apocryphal work, on the other hand, typically requires a morning cleared of any pressing commitments and a soundproofed room. Of all the apocryphal works, none is quite so wearying as the Acts of John. But so yeah,
He is a great author.
he's great. He's a fantastic writer. But his
Yes.
point is that when you move from the Gospels, even John, at his most lofty, is still immediately compelling in a way that the apocryphal works tend to just get lost in an almost like fan fiction-y, nerdy kind of like it's so intense. It's like if your friend came up to you and started just ad nauseum going on and on about their Dungeons and Dragons characters, and you're like, dude, I don't care. It's really it has that kind of feel. It doesn't have the immediacy and gripping effect of the stuff that was accepted in the New Testament. Now that's painting a little broadly. There are apocryphal works that are as engaging as the New Testament, but the bulk of it, there's pretty good reasons for them having said, we're not putting out the Bible. That's crazy talk. No. So, but there's a lot of it, and there is historical value to looking at them and saying, oh, so this was used by a community of early believers. So this is what they believed. Interesting, And what you find is a fair bit of diversity that gradually gets winnowed out of, and part of that job was done by the early church fathers. One of their favorite pastimes was writing against ideas and groups that they found heretical. So let's jump into this page.
I have one question before you jump.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. Is that Brad Thor? Because the author of the
Apostle? No, it's Tom Bissell.
Tom Bissell?
Yeah. Travels Among the Tombs of the 12.
Oh, okay.
And then too, people are sometimes not open to any new trains of thought.
Yeah.
New paths of thought. They resist so much, So.
Well, and and this is a bit of sort of my I find this intriguing and interesting. What is also interesting about this is that the majority of the patristic writers will have been, on some basic level, either Pauline by their kind of origins, or possibly Johannine. So being from Paul or from John, Johannine, but a Gentile, a Gentile group from the Johannine community, and so what we're reading when we read when we read patristics is often at some remove from Jewish Christianity, which fundamentally, around the destruction of the temple and the sacking of Jerusalem, really starts to lose. I mean, that would have been the bulk of it. Paul was rare. The majority of the early church was still making its message, like taking its message out to the Jewish population, both at home and in the diaspora.
And if you look on your page here, on this page, just look at the years. The Gospel of Mark was the earliest one. It was kind of put together about the year 60. And then the book of Acts was kind of concurrent, but a little bit later. But if you look at these years, 155 to 220. Those years, like you say, they were several, 2-3 generations removed from the Jewish, Christian community. And so, and it still wasn't until, 325, that they
The Council
finally
of Nicaea,
became a little more formalized in how the church would exist. And they even had denominations back then, like Johannine or the Pauline, the various apostles, and it kind of goes with the scholars. Or, well, I'm a follower of John the Baptist, would say, in Jesus' day. Well, I'm a follower of this and that. And in the Acts, they would say, well, I'm not going to get baptized by that person because he's a follower of Peter. So there's factions, I say, throughout. And what I think what you said is that,
Somebody got a finger
the
caught.
patristics, I hope not, the patristic people will finally start to come together and collect and gather all the things from the background of faith. So, church fathers, there were some church mothers as well. We don't know them as well, but I don't know. Names like Tertullian. That's a common word, you know, Tertullian of Carthage, now Tunisia. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons in France. So you see, the gospel had already been in France. I like Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, which is Turkey. So
She okay?
Yeah,
She
She fall.
I got knocked by the door.
we have the door
Yeah.
like propped so they can.
Yeah, she tried to open it and then it came back and hit her as she was coming in. So it's also worth observing that even at the Council of Nicaea, one of the reasons it was convened was because there was a huge population of Christians who were of a belief, who held, their theology was largely what is called Arian. And it's surprising to a lot of people who don't know this, like this had gone really wide. Like when they said, no, Arius and what he believes is heresy, they were talking about huge swaths of people. In fact, when they talk about about how Rome finally fell to the Goths, right, which is these sort of northern Germanic group, well, not just northern, there are people in from the west as well, but Rome fell to the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and all the whatever, that these Gothic peoples came down and sacked Rome, and that these pagan groups, whereas Rome were, they were Christians, of course. That's not true. The Goths were already Christian. They had already been evangelized, but they were Arian Christians. And so that doesn't count. But Arius was himself a bishop, and a bunch of people believed in the same things that he believed. And it's very interesting to note that by the Council of Nicaea in 325, when they're hammering these things out and going, what is the right thing to think here? It basically took a bunch of people who were Christians, who counted themselves as Christians and counted themselves as the faithful, and said, but Christianity isn't what you guys believe. And so that's an interesting.
I'm trying to condense what Arianism is, because I still remember in seminary it was so confusing for us to understand what was wrong with it.
It's not as staunchly Trinitarian.
Right, it's not Trinitarian, and it's okay not to be Trinitarian, but it's more of that Jesus was
It created
directly by God, and it kind of takes away.
Rather than pre-existed.
Right. Yeah.
That Jesus was a creation like everything else in creation, and that Jesus was elevated to a deified status.
Yes, like he was a demigod, and undermined the Christian concept of redemption, since only he who is truly God could be deemed to have been reconciled to God. So it's kind of an odd thing, but if you could imagine, if you're confused and you kind of know the church history, then just imagine how they had to sift all this out.
I mean, I personally, I find even Orthodox belief to be at some point along. I usually say that, like, from the Council of Nicaea onward, I'm just like allergic to it. I just don't care, because I just find, again, even Orthodox belief still takes on that kind of Dungeons and Dragons kind of like a bunch of dudes sitting around navel gazing and go, but like, what if this? And you're like, ugh.
Yeah.
But
it is within the tradition, because that's what a lot of the Jewish leaders would do.
A lot of
They were
dialogue,
entitled
for sure.
to debate the
Yeah.
text and to kind of pick it apart and see
Yeah.
what it actually
It's
means
definitely part of that same
for us
tradition.
in our time.
But it definitely has a, I mean, it still goes on today.
There was probably some patronizing going on, or some hierarchical
Yeah.
power
But
games.
going back earlier, because some of these church fathers go back really quite early. Polycarp is one of the earliest.
It's amazing.
Clement of Rome is very early. These are people who knew the disciples, studied under the disciples. So because Jesus was not viewed as the founder of a new religion, but rather seen as the climax of an existing story, this Jewish story, the early Christians turned to the Hebrew Bible to interpret his significance. So the early church made a big deal about looking at Hebrew scriptures, even non-Jews, even Gentile believers were instructed in the Hebrew. They're like, do you see how even in these Hebrew sacred scriptures, this Jesus fella is clearly he's what is the next natural step. Yeah. The authority in the church was a tender issue. Otherwise confident enough to express differences of opinion and open argument, Paul confirms the sensitivity of the issue by taking pains to emphasize that his views were in line with those of Jesus' brother James, who was the leader in Jerusalem. So it's interesting how often, the New Testament itself demonstrates how often differences of opinion were common. Anybody who's reading it, even sort of carefully, will see that what's going on is infighting, as argument. Much of the sharing of the message initially was by oral transmission. Even the letters that were written to various churches were intended to be read aloud to the church, to the community. Christian doctrine generally, and Gnosticism, which is an almost too broad category, because if you say Gnostic belief, that assumes that Gnostic Christianity is a little too homogenous a flavor. It's a little too one flavor, but actually what is generally meant by scholars when they say Gnostic Christianity is any one of a handful of diverse groups that could be loosely connected by a handful of beliefs, a handful of things that they share in common, one of which was a heavy dose of philosophical dualism. So mind-body, or in this case, which would be, it's called Cartesian dualism, the mind-body sort of paradox. There's the I, and then I say my I and my body. There's an I that is not my body.
Yin yang.
Well,
No, it's more like if you say my body, who's doing the talking? Because science would tell you, well, you are your body. You and your brain are your body. That's it. There is no I that is not your body. But we say, well, I am here, but my body is failing or something. But we're natural dualists. Psychologists have observed this for years, that we tend towards a natural dualism, thinking of ourselves and our consciousness as somehow not identical to, but almost like some people talk about it like the ghost in the machine, right? That we're driving this body, but it is not the sum total of us, right? Anyway, Gnostics were heavily dualist, and one of the other things that Gnosticism tends to share is a bit of world renunciation, because gnosis means knowledge in Greek. So if you say agnosis or agnostic, what does agnostic means? I don't know, right? So gnosis is knowledge. So there's a tendency in Gnostic belief to believe that kind of semi-secret teachings, or looking into, and this is why they tend to be mystical. You look into it, you study it, and you gain knowledge that is otherwise semi-secret from the masses, and thereby you release yourself somewhat through mystical seeking and renunciation of the world, which is another big part, is renunciation of the world. And you then kind of extract your
Yeah.
the part of you. This is where the dualism comes in. You leave behind the flesh and extract, release your soul. So it's
Which,
yeah.
when you talked about in the video, the nephesh
Mm-hmm.
and the,
Pneuma, or soul.
what was the other word?
Well, the pneuma, or well in Greek or in
Nephesh and the
ruach.
ruach, yeah.
Yeah, in Hebrew.
So, when the Gnostic Gospels came, they were, look, this is not the root, this is not where Jesus came from, and this is not the tradition from which Jesus came. And that's
Yeah.
probably why they were, but it seeped into our culture, our Christian culture,
Yeah.
that we are separate beings, that we're not one whole being.
Yeah, which is one of the reasons that the question of the resurrection was relevant, because is it a bodily resurrection, or is it a glorified body, or is it just his spirit, or what's going on here? Do you really believe that because the majority of the Jewish tradition says the creation is good. It may not be perfect. There may be something going on that is fallible and flawed within it. But fundamentally, God's creation is good. The Gnostic picture is that everything in the creation is just entirely corrupted, and needs to be escaped in a way.
As if the kingdom wasn't already here. As if
That's
God
also
were now
this is
present.
yeah. So Gnosticism was generally overall kind of rejected, So this is where dualism comes in. The urge to begin identifying and collecting writings that were deemed both orthodox and authoritative was begun in part as a reaction to a similar effort by an early Gnostic Christian teacher named Marcion, who had created his own canon. He had started to collect he had his own collection, and we know what was in it. And that's one of the ways that we know that the New Testament was fairly accepted fairly early, because he accepted most of what's in, he collected most of what is in our New Testament today. But he rejected a couple things, I think, and he also rejected the entire Hebrew Bible. He did not have an Old Testament in there. He thought that the Old Testament was an evil God that was not the God that he saw in Jesus, and he thought that it was.
And just think how far back that goes. There's still people say, well, it's not the God of the Old Testament.
Yes, we still.
But if you read the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament is as loving and tender and gracious, is the same God.
That's true. Well, more importantly,
And
it's
when
the God Jesus would have claimed. Jesus claimed. He quotes those are his scriptures. So if you
And when the wrath of God, when you study the Old Testament, when a prophet says, "And God said," when you see the parts, for example, in one of the Psalms, it's like, "Dash your enemies' babies' heads on the wall," or something like that.
Yeah.
God is not speaking. It never says, "God said." It's the writers are saying that.
Oh, right,
So
because a lot
that's-
of people broke from their own level of consciousness,
Mhm.
and so
Yeah.
everything was, it was just, and it's kind of, when you read the Bible, I guess for face value, word for word,
Mhm.
you would get very confused.
Well, it's
Yeah.
very hard, especially since we're not Israelites of, from 3,000 years ago. It's hard to know.
They were eating some mushrooms, man.
Yeah, they have
There is
their
actually
worldview.
a theory that there are some theories that there are that some psychedelic substances were part of various traditions along the way. They have found cannabinoids or cannabis stuff in some of the incense things of some
Can we start that here? I can smell it.
Okay, so among the early church fathers, the apostolic fathers are those who were traditionally believed to have been followers of, so they're called the apostolic fathers, the ones who were followers of the original 12 disciples. Their writings, though popular, widely circulated, and giving great insight into developing Christian thought, were ultimately not included in the canon. So that would be people like Polycarp, people like Clement of Rome. These are some of the earliest things. I think Papias was also a hearer of John. Ignatius was a student of John, and he wrote a lot. On the way to his death, he to being martyred, he sent out, was it like 7, I think? Something like 7 letters to a variety of churches along the way, and those we still have. But they weren't finally included in the canon. They were kept as early church literature. As doctrine developed, one of the earliest activities of the early church fathers, as I mentioned, was the calling out of various sects and individuals for beliefs that they thought incorrect, referred to as heresies. Called the father of Latin Christianity because he was the first to write in Latin and not in Greek. He's also called the founder of Western theology. Tertullian of Carthage, which is now Tunisia. Carthage would be in Tunisia. Carthage was a city, but was the first to write books of apologetics. Do you know what apologetics is? So the word apologia, what's that? What's that?
Apologize.
Well, it's where we get the word apologize. Apologia means like reason. Whoops, I can't spell. Reason or excuse or explanation. That kind of thing. Which is why we say, "Oh, I apologize. I had I was late because of traffic or whatever." When you're apologizing, what you're doing is you're laying out the reasons for a thing.
It's sometimes when you see the introduction to something, to a book or text, it would say apology. They would call that an apology.
Yeah, and so apologetics is people laying out a case for why they believe as they do. Especially in Christian apologetics, it's why do I believe Jesus is this and that, right?
Religious doctrine.
A religious doctrine. Well, I mean,
Like, why do you
yes,
believe it? You can
that's a little
explain
specific,
it.
but yeah.
Like
Or
maybe
why you believe a religious doctrine. Yes,
The
yes.
sermon could even be called an apology, because it's an explanation
Wow.
or a reason.
Yeah.
Not as technically though, but.
Yeah, but so the early church fathers, particularly as the church was expanding and converting people, apologetics was a big part. So he was defending early Christianity against early heresies and accusations. Tertullian was the first to record the concept of the Trinity. Ironically, he was himself rejected for sainthood by the greater church over some time because some of his beliefs were themselves later deemed heretical. The same thing happened with a famous teacher named Origen, who I think more people should read. He was a very famous, very erudite, very knowledgeable early Christian teacher, and more people would do well to read him to get clarity on some things, because he was fluent in Greek. I think he also read Hebrew, so he was a very, very capable teacher, and he's one of the great teachers in the church.
So it's
What's his name?
O-R-I-G-E.
Origin.
O-R-I,
R-I.
G-E-N.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the bottom of it.
Yeah, it's actually
on the
down.
bottom
It's
of your page.
it's there lower on the page. Yeah.
It's in the list here of the names.
Yeah. So these teachers and disciples, the relationships spread out broadly around the Mediterranean over the first 2 centuries. Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon in France, was famous for writing a book against heresies. He himself was a disciple of Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna in Turkey, who himself is thought to have been a disciple of John, one of the original 12. Among the prominent apologists, theologians, and defenders against heresy were North African Christian leaders from the ante-Nicene period. Now, if you see anti, many of you may know this already, but anti, A-N-T-I, means against. A-N-T-E, anti, means before. So ante-Nicene means before the Council of Nicaea. There were people before who were writing and people after who were all considered, church fathers. That's all still part of the patristics. But the ante-Nicene fathers are the ones before. Another anti that you'll run into in biblical terminology is antediluvian, if you remember that word. Anybody remember antediluvian? The antediluvian patriarchs, you remember?
Nope.
I remember, but I can't.
It means before the flood, before the deluge.
Oh,
Yeah, so the antediluvian patriarchs.
Yeah.
So, so the one prominent Christian teacher I mentioned, Origen of Alexandria, was rumored to have castrated himself to maintain a life of strict asceticism, based on his understanding of Matthew 19:12, those who make themselves eunuchs for the glory of God. And so he was rumored to have castrated
Where
himself.
are those evangelicals that say they take their Bible literally? Please.
The patristic era is roughly considered to have included everything from the earliest apostolic era down to a century or more after the Council of Nicaea, so the ante and the post-Nicene people. Among the influential thinkers and writers from this period are the following. Bloop, 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 bloop.
Yeah,
All those
all
folks.
these guys. Look at the years,
Yeah, it
It's
goes.
just amazing.
Yeah, there's.
And all their various locations, That was a lot, that's a big territory.
Yeah, I meant to talk about this one at the start, because I had mentioned this last time. When Paul goes to see James and Peter and John in Jerusalem, before he starts his when he's starting his ministry in earnest, it's believed by many scholars today, and it's getting a lot more traction, I think, that what they agreed upon in terms of when they were saying, okay, well, you're going to go out to the Gentiles, and he's like, yeah, I want to go to the Gentiles. I'll be the apostle to the Gentiles. And they're like, okay, well, what are you going to tell them? Many people think that that a pretty close approximation of what Paul said, or what they all agree, they're like, okay, if that's what you tell them, that'll be fine. Is the more or less corresponds to the 7 laws of the Noahide covenant, when based on early the word what's the word I'm looking for, exegesis. So this is a good word, exegesis and eisegesis. Do this in red.
A lot of us
Did you
get,
take Latin in school?
a lot of
No.
us get, now you just have to learn that stuff when you're studying the Bible and history of the church.
My mom took Latin, Bruce took Latin.
Oh my gosh, I tried, but I couldn't do it.
So exegesis, the word ex means out of. So extraordinary means that's out of the ordinary.
Like if you're looking
Trying
at
to
the
think of others.
Bible, it's like one of the things that when you're preaching or teaching any text, you just can't rely on what your own thoughts are. You have to look out and see what others have said about it and what does it say itself.
Yeah.
That would be the exegesis.
Well, exegesis compared to eisegesis, exegesis is specifically extracting meaning from the text. It's reading, it's taking out of from the text, it's taking it out. So you're extracting meaning from the text. And it's basically, it's interpretation. However, there's another type of interpretation, which is eisegesis, that adds meaning to the text. So you're inserting information into the text as part of your interpretation. And so, for example, exegesis, okay, when I said, I think it makes some sense that possibly what he's saying about some of you here today will not, and then the next thing is the transfiguration. That would be exegesis, because I'm not adding anything to the text, I'm just seeing the juxtaposition of those two things, or I should say the positioning of those two stories right next to each other, and saying there's some sense to be made that these two are correlated, that these two stories are together. On the other hand,
what happened 6 days before?
right, it happens just before. That would be interpreting just from what's in there, just from looking at the text, not adding anything to it. On the other hand, if you look at the beginning, the first page of the Bible has God creating Adam and Eve, or God creating man and woman. And God says, let us create man in our image. In our image, let us create them. And that's plural, which is weird for God to speak about God's self in plural. So, God, many Christians, what's that?
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
That's eisegesis, because that is we're taking a Jewish document that does not have a Trinitarian concept in it, and we are looking as Christians and reading into it a plural that we would recognize as the Trinity, but that's not there in the text. Number one, it's not there in Judaism per se. Number two, and so we are importing a Christian concept into a text that does not have it. That doesn't mean eisegesis is wrong. It just means that that's what's happening. And it's important when doing interpretive, doing any interpretive work, to just be clear about whether you're doing exegetical interpretation or eisegetical interpretation, because it's fine to say, well, when I read this, this is what I see, and you're bringing something to the text eisegetically, but somebody else can go, okay, but I legit don't see that there. Like I don't, whatever. You go, no, it's fair. I see that because that's what I'm bringing to the text.
Yeah.
And that's fine. There are lots of legitimate eisegetical things for sure, but it's important to realize what you're doing.
That makes so much sense to me.
Right, it's just important to know what you're doing. Be clear about what you're doing. Not because it's wrong to do one or the other, but because you should know you're doing it.
Yeah, and that's a perfect example as to why it took such a long time and so much conversation to decide what to put in the canon and what to keep out, or to decide to determine, well, what do we believe? Because they don't want to get stuck. We look at the text for what it is, but we also can't help ourselves to put into it our own experience and our own desires for what we want it to say.
Well,
and that's good though sometimes, because the eisegesis, if you allow the text to speak to you, you can put yourself into it, which is why Psalms or your favorite Bible verse has meaning to you.
So therefore, it's not. I mean, it's really no right and really no wrong. It's just basically your interpretation, or
I think that would,
right and wrong.
There would be. I think there are probably limits. There are probably upper limits on most things. It's like just because it's possible to fly doesn't mean that I can fly in a plane, but I can't fly by flapping my arms. So there will be upper limits on in certain categories and in certain arenas where an interpretation doesn't remotely make sense,
and that's
or where something starts to strain. Whether strain, it's maybe,
we
but
call it a cloud of witnesses, and that's why when we read a text that we say is a holy text, there's so much heavy weight we put into that, versus I love Jacqueline Winspear as an author. I can get stuff from her mystery novels, but I'm not going to put in my own beliefs necessarily into that and say, well, my interpretation of this book, it's just good enough. Because there have been so many people who have, in all of history, read and studied the original language, how it has been preached, how it has been lived. I need to take that cloud of witnesses to heart when I'm reading the Bible, and if I'm trying to preach or teach the Bible. It's not just about what I want it to mean. That if you think about in the history of the United States, various groups of people have been persecuted and oppressed because of what I say the Bible says. And that is wrong. There is a right and wrong. I can justify a lot of things, a lot of behaviors, and a lot of oppressions and persecutions. The one patristic, one early church father castrated himself. Is that what it means? I don't think so. You know, so that's why it's important to study with other people, and even if you're sitting in your room by yourself, like if you have a study book like this, like I know personally, he's long gone now, but one of the Roland Murphy and Bruce Metzger, they're editors, but they're scholars, and that's why it's a good thing. Like when we've done our Zoom Bible studies, I encourage people to have different translations, not different interpretations, but actual translations of the Bible, because that's a whole bunch of scholars doing exegesis on what is that language, what words did we choose as a group of scholars who've studied Greek and Latin and Hebrew to put into that, and it gives you a wealth of understandings.
I'm gonna just push back on that for 1 second, and that's just because on one count, because it's important to remember that translation as an activity all by itself is an interpretive activity.
It is an interpretive.
Because
the
choice of certain words with certain connotations and with certain meanings makes a difference. So I'll give you just one example of something. Yeah, that's true. That's because I'll give you just one example of reading. One of my favorite, my preferred New Testament translation is by a guy named David Bentley Hart. I'm going to be actually sharing something about the words spirit and soul by him with you guys at some point. But he points out that in his word choices for translating, some of them he left, or some of them he translated a little bit awkwardly, because he said, we've gotten too comfortable with the word as it usually is, and it doesn't really mean what the English word means to us does not mean what the Greek word meant to the listening audience of then. And so so for example, the word church. The word church he translated as the assembly, because the word church to us has certain meaning to us, but at the end of the day, it was not at all. It had no idea of a building. It had no idea of a particular structure or a congregation or a sanctuary or anything like that. But it was a commonplace word meaning the people gathered, right? And so, right, things like that. But another big one that really kind of shook me was when he said, I have decided to render the word normally translated as earth just in its original Greek, because we still use the word already, and that's cosmos. For a lot of translations, the word cosmos in Greek gets translated as earth in the New Testament, but that's not the cosmos.
No.
And so it really changes the scope of what's being talked about. It's like, and the something when those days, and the something, whatever, you realize that actually what's being talked about is the whole creation, rather than just the earth. And that it's a much, much bigger scope. It's much like, this is that when something happens in those days or in these days, and what it is to the cosmos versus just like our planet. And that's a hugely different experience to read certain passages with that word versus the earth.
And it might open it up a new way.
Yeah.
For each time. That's why it's really kind of cool. There's a website called Bible Gateway that I think I sent that link out. It tells you can go see. They just have tons of translations and interpretations. But it's really fun for me. I was a big stick in the mud with the RSV when NRSV came out. Like, I can't change my Bible. Now I understand why all these people didn't want to go from King James to but I decided to be an open-minded person. But I also love reading. Sometimes this is an interpretation, not a translation. But there's another person named Eugene Peterson. He's kind of gotten off the cliff currently, but he has a real fun interpretation of much of the Bible stories. They're very vernacular. And sometimes if I'm struggling, like I probably shared, John is not my favorite book to preach on, but so I'll go to hear what Eugene Peterson has to say, and his thing is kind of like, brings it down to earth for me. But yeah, it's
I love the way you said it, kind of off the cliff, isn't it?
well,
The
he has
time
gotten
we're
kind of off
living
the
in.
cliff. He's gotten kind of really into the right wing, which is not a helpful place to be.
Oh.
But anyway, so yeah, and just think of all the struggles these guys had.
Well, most of them got killed.
Yeah,
Yeah, many of them were put to death.
saying what
That
they
was a
said.
struggle.
Yeah, but the
Struggle, all right.
but so basically what this is, these 7 laws were an early Jewish exegetical interpretation of Genesis 9 and the covenant that was established between Noah and God. And so it's generally believed by I think that it's more and more it's generally believed that when Paul went to James, Peter, and John and he said, I'd like to go out to the Gentiles, that they basically said, okay, if this is what you're telling them, something like this, that's probably good. They don't, any more than that would be
You'd be
more Jewish than necessary. Anything less than that would not be sufficiently righteous and just. So, yeah. So anyway, because that would in fact be pre-Abraham, certainly pre-Moses. It would be what God established with Noah at the start of a new repopulating of the earth. So that would be his covenant with the people of all nations that came from it, especially since all the nations presumably came from Noah. The Shemites or Semites, and the Japhethites and the Hamites and all the groups of that would be their offspring. So that's So that's that for your little reading at home. Anyway, so that's any questions.